All right, I think like in the past, I'm going to sort of open this up to the floor because we have such an audience that's amazing right in front of us, and I really like them to engage in thinking about the title of the symposium, Remodeling in Arts. What does that actually constitute? But before doing that, I just want to get things started by maybe bringing out a couple of points that I thought would require some more discussion. There are three things that came out for me. One was community, and Jackie's presentation really kind of focused in on that. What does that constitute, and what should it constitute for CCC? Another one was home, the idea of home, and again, critically thinking about what home is or can be. And the third concept was whiteness. That seemed to be an underlying, anchor to all the discussions. How does whiteness sort of fit into these conversations? It's often the invisible other. It's becoming more visible, actually, in popular culture, but it's something that also needs to be, I think, examined and thought about. And I think Summer began to bring up some of these points already in her work. And just briefly to Summer's point, when she talked about artworks and how they are doing a kind of work on their own, and I really do believe that. For me, as someone who just writes about art, works of art help me to kind of solve or think about problems. So often it's not about describing a work, but taking that work to a different place. But that sometimes artists are years ahead of us, right? And they're able to do things that are outside of language. So the artistic practice is something I want to say is important and not to be considered secondary to language and words. So maybe just to start with, if all of you, take any of these points I mentioned, community, whiteness, or home, how do you think that relates to your practice, and how do you think it could or could not relate to CCC in the future?
It wasn't about one of your questions, but what you talked about. Actually, I'm thinking about what Summer talked about in her presentation too. The idea of like, how do we stay genuine to who we are? How do we kind of trust in ourselves and just continue to do what we do? Coming back to one of the points you made, I'm thinking the best work I can do is the work that does not have any label attached to it. People can just respond to without thinking, oh, this is from a female Chinese American artist. I am hoping that the work can exist in its own and continue on in its own. I think those will be the strongest, most relevant work.
I think the hardest part for me, though, is I hear what you're saying about that. There are all these, feelings about it that are absolutely not only warranted, but should be expressed. And the other things are the ways that other artists are totally unmarked. So I think that most people go into a museum, and when they think they're going to see art, there's no hyphen in front of Jackson Pollock's name or Vincent van Gogh's name, right? So there's a way in which those things are taking up space that never gets inflected. And so rather than imagine that there's a space in which there will be no description, it'll be like, I forget who was saying the sort of long description of things. Maybe it was you, Summer. Maybe that's what we should be going for the longer, fuller description of people. I don't know if that makes sense. I think it would bring a lot of visibility to not only what we consider art history, but what we need to know more about collecting practices in terms of museums and other institutions.
I just had a little personal example of what you're talking about. It was maybe a year or two ago when Abby, you curated the present tense, and it happened to be mostly women who were in the show, and somebody at the CCC landed a deal with the billboard companies, and I was driving through San Francisco, and I saw artwork, and I can't remember her name because I'm terrible at names, but the Korean American artist, and it was her body in a beautiful poetic art piece, and I cried. And I called Abby, I was like, do you know, I don't think I can remember seeing an image of an Asian American woman artist in the public sphere. And I said, it touched to me the first time the feeling that how invisible the work is in this community and the artists that we're here representing is. So I don't think we're ready to throw away these, titles and this issue, but because of those moments where I was like, wow, how have I lived this long in San Francisco and not seen a contemporary art image of an Asian American artist in the city? So,
yeah, I think it's so interesting that Hoy, who just started the job here, was one of my students at a time when all of this stuff kind of came to a head. I think identity politics was the kind of predominant cloud that sort of floated over a lot of our conversations. And I think it was unfortunate I'm sorry, I'm calling you out. In our class, I think one of the loudest concerns was that you had artists that were not of color concerned that there was a deprivation of subject matter on the part of people who were not able to identify. And I think that even in the faculty, this was something that really overrode most of the conversation. And I do think that is a valid problem in that people are kind of kept in their own lanes. But I think what you brought up, what you brought up is really true, that it's almost, if you look at it the other way, it's a deprivation of artists of color from being able to make work that isn't kind of colored by who they are. It's almost as if universality or kind of broader concerns or even formalism is something that's only achievable by a person who isn't fettered by an adjective. And I think both of these things are deeply problematic, and it's growing as an educator in the classroom. I think it's something that comes up, and I don't have a solution for this. But I think to kind of apply this question of whiteness is a really good one. I think that if you take whiteness as a synonym for, if not universality, I mean, you could look at it another way, of complexity. We had a conversation in this class that sort of resonates with me, and somebody had pointed out that it's rare that even now in popular culture, you're only allowed, almost like you're only given license to give, to create an unflattering portrayal of an individual if you aren't going to be subjecting yourself to accusations of being prejudiced or providing some sort of negative view of something. And the example that came up was the TV show Sex and the City and the TV show Girls, where you can have an entire cast of characters who are kind of horrible. If you were to change the race of the people that are in this sort of show, I feel like that doesn't smell right. And I feel like I would like the opportunity to portray people of color in a negative light without being worried that something is, it's because it's an incomplete picture. It's like there's a loss of the fullness of depiction within those sorts of contexts. I'm sorry, I went off the rails.
I wanted to respond actually to two things. One of them is what Jackie was saying, that sort of calling for actually a more expanded conversation, where contextualization is important as a way of framing actually all the practices that we discussed today. But the other thing is that I think that it's actually the curatorial work that's being done here at Chinese Cultural Center actually begins to break down some of these notions, again, as I said before in the discussion of what constitutes Chineseness, that it is possible to present shows like this in a framework that is seen as ethnic specific, that in fact it opens out to like a lot of different possible points of connection. And when several people here brought up the idea of cosmopolitanism, and the idea of polycentrism as a way of working, as a way of living, as a way of experiencing and making connections in the world, that actually this type of model begins to break down these, to my mind, really bifurcated and problematic ideas, as if it's sort of the identity politics debate has become so contaminated that it's hard to talk about it. And there's absolutely, in other words, each of these practices points to the fact that you can engage with issues of Chineseness and not in a static manner. And I think that's the brilliance of some of the curatorial projects that are coming out of here. Is the reframing of this. So in fact, I hate for us to fall back into the same sort of dichotomous conversation that all of us are well to aware of, have taken part in, have been damaged by, bear a few scars here and there. And I think, personally, as somebody who's curated, shows like, Asian American identities, contemporary Asian American art that I did back in 1994 for the Asia Society galleries, the show was actually very much a transnational show. It was all foreign-born artists dealing with all kinds of issues of positionality related to, sort of positioning themselves in a different society than the one they were born in. And yet, it fell back into, being seen as a multicultural show. And why? Because those are the debates of that moment. This is like, the mid-90s, which is like, my God. I mean, it was like right around the Whitney Biennial and all this stuff where there's a huge debate around these questions. So naturally it becomes, sort of, enfolded within a discourse, a critical discourse that, promoted a certain kind of reading. So in a way, what's interesting here is that because you also have critics, scholars, artists together, that's a possibility, through our conversation, beginning to sort of unpack that. So I think that in that sense, I mean, what CCC is doing is really important to beginning to break this down.
Margo, I want to ask you about what would be your vision of the next step for these issues? For like, is the model a cultural institution that can do this, or what do the major institutions need to do to move past this phase?
I almost feel like CCC is better positioned to do this, frankly, and so the museums. But maybe that's a conversation for the afternoon, because this is something that I don't want to take away from the artists who are here, because I think it's really your moment to begin to talk about some of this. And because I do have some ideas about that, but I do think that this type of conversation that involves like a constellation of different practitioners, I mean, it's like a big ecology, and we're all involved at different levels in the process of meaning making. And so meaning making is artists, meaning making is interpreters and scholars, and that it's part of a dialogic process. And so I think the fact that we're having this dialogue here, again, is part of the knowledge production that I think has to happen.
I think to be an artist, I want to cut back to the art issues. So for me, I think it's how can you discover about human nature? It actually is very deep. When you do work, then you find it's more you don't know. Something is very construction. It's not like contradiction. It's not like it's a surface you can see. So the art help you to understand myself, is understand human being, understand other people. But I think it's a Chinese culture it's right track. So they do things that go, it's a very different direction from typical organization. So they try to help people to understand more, and in the same way as how artists can understand that too.
Okay, that was really great. I mean, I was going to say that the organization, the signifier of Chinese misfires, right? Like that, what you expect you're going to see isn't necessarily always there, and that helps destabilize and rethink what your own interpretation of Chinese is, for instance. So there's something that came up that Margo mentioned with the process of the dialogic that Margo writes about brilliantly in her book, Unsettled Visions. The relationship between the artist, the writer, the art historian, and the critic. And some of the artists I noticed also brought up, that relationship, cultivating that was quite instrumental and helpful in the end product, you could say. So, that I'm curious. I would love for all of you guys to just talk about that relationship, whether it's between an artist and curator, or vice versa, or art historian and an artist, how that needs to be incorporated into an institution into a more organic way, because I don't see that normally. We don't really hear, we don't know about those stories or how those conversations developed and what they where they led in a way.
I also think those relationships are more often fraught with problems than they are, instance of letting art do its utmost work. As an artist, I think I can think of working with other curators who did not understand this and how toxic and horrible it can feel that you kind of want to quit as an artist. And also that there's been art writing in the past that I felt like it diminished artwork, or also even didn't allow the audience to experience the artwork for themselves in a way. Or I feel like most of the time the relationships can be really problematic. And I do feel that one of the visions that Abby had was to create these relationships, and she tends to curate people who are really good at doing it in the right way. And I always felt when I go to different places and Abby introduces me to people in art places, like even in Asia or whatever, I'm always like, God, there are more people out there that really get this than I thought, Abby. She's like, oh, no, I curated these people. Like, I had to go through a lot of assholes to get to these people. And I think it's really special. Because there's so many opportunities for the commercial part, the exploitations, the racisms, everything to really play itself out in these relationships that it's very rare when they don't.
Yeah, I just want to follow up on what you just said. Actually, from your presentation, you said artists shouldn't talk too much about their artwork, and that sounded so true. If I don't have to talk about my art, that will be great. I have so much more time and energy just to make. And that's where I see, I think the writers, they understand and know a lot more, at least in my personal opinion, a lot of times than I do in words. It's a lot harder to kind of justify the work, which is in a way a necessity in our current time. You have to be able to present, apply for things, for example. But I do think that relationship is so important in meaningful collaboration, in meaningful projects like what we've done here at CCC. So I feel like artists need writers, and we need the right writers. Sometimes I will receive a piece of writing and I will learn something that I wasn't able to articulate myself. And that's when I realized, there are all these things we can still gain by this exchange, by this conversation. And that's exactly what we're doing here today. So I think it's an excellent format, and I hope it continues.
Can I play devil's advocate for a second? So I also really admire Abby's ability to bring good people together. And you can create this sort of idyllic environment within which your work can almost take on a life of its own and be read by people that are like-minded and that have the ability to empathize with the subject matter or the materials as they're being presented. But is that potentially a limitation unto itself? You said that you had to, that Abby, I can't remember your phrasing, that Abby had to dig through a lot of assholes to find this group of people. But you can't. But those assholes still exist. And I think that there is, as an educator and working with young artists who usually are in the space that is very populated by these assholes, is it not a shirking of responsibility to engage them and to kind of incorporate them into the view of the world that your work's going to live in. I've always been very skeptical of the autonomy of my own work for that reason.
I'd say many people with the Me Too movement would say that you can't engage with the assholes or their work. It's a vetting process, and I think this is an interesting part of the institution again. That what is that vetting process, and what kind of people are they bringing in? Even though we're not meeting the people, we're seeing the work. But I don't think it necessarily means we have to bring in folks that are disreputable in some way.
Sorry, just to clarify, I feel like whether or not something is I think that it's a subjective sort of assessment where I worry about sort of ideological elitism in sort of discounting assholes.
For me, it's as simple as there are the people I've encountered. Because to an artist, it's more clear to me that I just have to protect my ability to keep wanting to make work. And I feel like, like I said, it drifts away so easily, and there's so many things that fight it, that for an artist, it's just for me to follow people and conditions that foster that aliveness, whatever that means. And if there are people out there that are against that, then there's no way to work with that. And maybe that is up for people. And Abby had to deal with some assholes for me, which helped, because I think there are times I'm like, I'm pulling out of this show, Abby. She's like, no. And she would go and help deal with it. And I kind of feel like artists need that kind of bodyguard in a way.
Yeah, I think I was just imagining that there's words that are in contestation with other words. So it's not just a competition to see who will get the last word or who will win, like a wrestling match. But I think in this context, that artists, I'm working with artists, MFAs, BFAs, it's really important to say something. You don't have to win the arm wrestling contest, but you have to get it out there, because so many audiences want to know what you're trying to do. And yes, a lot of artists, especially younger artists, will say, well, if I could say it in words or if I could write it, I would do that, but I'm making something in lieu of that, and I totally get that. But I do think that the general public does not understand what artists are thinking, wanting, and doing. And as I always say, modernism is not a one battle. There are still people wondering why a urinal turned on its head is an artwork. And until we stop making that a mystery, it's going to be a problem. It's a matter of distribution. It's almost like it has to come on as often as an ad for McDonald's comes on. And that's the only reason why people still wonder about these questions, because they're looming. We can walk through these galleries, SF MoMA's galleries, Minnesota Street projects, De Young, and there are still people saying, why is this here? And there's a lot of reasons for it that are still mysterious to people. We do ourselves no service by being mute.
To go back to Adrian's point about subjectivity, that's so important, and I think that's what I'm really interested in. How can the institution make that subjectivity very visible? Because this is exactly the problem of art history, right? It's presented as an objective history, as if the works are somehow meant to unfurl the way they do, but they're highly subjective in terms of their organization. So it would be great to see that relationship more visible in some way.
Well, I think that to address both of those points, for me, I think that the answer is feelings, and I think that if you're looking at an artwork with the presumption, I think this is a problem that's propagated by a lot of educational departments at museums and art centers, is that when you look at an artwork and you think that the answer is to either figure out what the artist was trying to do, or to kind of decode the system of these symbols to create greater meaning that's like a puzzle or something, you lose the complexity and the subjectivity of the emotional content or the affect of the artwork that's in front of you. And what I worry, to take us all the way back to the beginning, what I worry about the sort of uptick in concerns about cultural appropriation and the use of, or the labeling of artworks as being the product of an adjective, is that you deprive people of the ability to then empathize with it. If I walk into an exhibition and it's an exhibition of East Asian queer women, working in southwestern China. To a certain extent, I feel as if my ability to then enter into that space as a human being is hampered by the fact that I almost have a voice in the back of my head now saying, well, am I allowed to feel like the person who is being told to me is the subject of the investigation, or am I left kind of acknowledging as opposed to position exchanging, if that makes any sense. And again, it's something that I'm coming across more and more in the classroom that I'm left without many answers to.
Just to respond to that, I mean, I think, first of all, so if I understand what you're saying, it's in other words, the frame itself, you feel is a kind of a restriction. So as you see the subject, and it's this type of show framed in this way, then you feel like a kind of restricted to what you can respond to. I guess, my response to that is that I personally don't think that the frame necessarily should hamper one. In other words, no, you can ignore the signage, you can ignore, the sort of the didactic material if you choose. But the problem to me is not having it as an option. And, and I think it always breaks down. It's just something that actually I consider to be kind of a conservative conversation, which is that was a very old argument in modernism. When people would say, if I wanted to send you a message, I would send you a telegram. That was like a famous quotation, where modernist artists, a lot of them thought that, in other words, you encounter the work, I don't need to explain anything to you. It's there. It says it all. But the point is that we recognize difference. Then we know that our reading is very particular to our own standpoint. And so what I bring to it, and obviously you always do, you read the work with the totality of your experience, your encounters, your history, and your cultural background. It's always there. But what I'm interested, at least as a viewer, in considering work is what does it teach me? What more can, I need to get some kind of context as part of that experience. So, as I said, the old argument used to be, well, it's in the materials, it's there. And this assumes, again, a kind of a universalism of reading, that I think is truly problematic intellectually. So I always get a little frustrated by that, by the way it breaks down into that, or it can, yeah.
I just want to clarify, I wasn't advocating for the removal of identity information.
Yeah.
It's just kind of highlighting an emergent problematic situation and the limits that I see it having on my reading.
Yeah. No, I think that we all recognize that problem. But I'm also saying that there is no, it's not a requirement to have to read it that way just because that material is there. But, if it's not there, then it's like kind of what Jackie was talking about. I mean, then it diminishes, the possibility for us, if we want to go further. And then also, I would say just one more thing, that, I taught for many years, and I taught MFA students as well as MAs. And some of the most valuable moments for us was actually, I used to bring them into the classroom and have, kids who were like the last year right before graduating, and have them talk about their work to undergraduates. And it forced them, in a way, to have to articulate some of these issues in their process. And later on, most of them said that it helped them to clarify it for themselves, because, as the artist, what the artist can get from it is having to work that through a little bit and be able to communicate it. And yeah, it's in a different medium and a different way of thinking and having to organize it. But, amazingly, there are a lot of graduate programs that, people walk out of and still can't do that. And it's actually hampering for them, because of the lack of clarity around at least thinking about what their process looks like. But anyway, so let me stop.
I am totally turned on by this issue, but I want to understand more where you're coming from. Because before today, I would say I'm a total unabashed modernist, where I do, I always quote this, the example of a Bach concerto that we can listen to it, and I'm brought to tears by it, but I can't tell you why. And I can't tell you the context. I don't even know that much about Bach. I don't even know much about instruments or why they're doing certain things, but there's something in that work that I can't appropriate that moves me to tears, and that has, I think, for, I guess it's been 200, 300 years, has. And so, to me, maybe it's about, as an artist, making work that's strong enough that I don't need the props of my own talking about it or other people negotiating it for me. That's where I've been coming from. But I really respect what you just said, that you can't, there are works that I don't want to take for granted. We're not in a vacuum, and even why work appears on the wall is a whole history of problems of race, class, culture, whatever, so economics, whatever. So I struggle with both, and I wonder if there's space for both this modernist feeling and then the option of having the context built in, and maybe it's the way the work is talked about and not reduced, that it's opened up.
It's for me. I remember one thing is they influenced myself for a long time. The first time in New York, I saw this Roscoe's painting in the whole dark room. The first time by visual art, I cried. So before I always think it's movie, music, make you quiet. It's very open. It's very easy. The more easy, touch, more emotional, and it's a art. It's a visual art. Why I stand his painting? So without any talk, I even didn't see any title in the article. So I just feel that kind of power and every information is come to me. They work for me. So that's make me for a long time. I think I just do my art. I don't need to explain. But like now it's a little. Little by later, I think you need response too. So you need people to really work. Then what's function your art with different people. So like it's one time, like Mary Ann, she read article for me. Then it really helped me to understand for this different perspective. And Abby read article about my art that helped me understand my life journal too. So the balance is between. It's not like you have to 100% rely your art by the ways of language, but that's the basic.
Okay, I didn't realize this, but we only have 3 minutes for all of you to engage. So other questions? Yeah.
Abby at CCC, well, I think all of your art is great medicine. Hopefully getting to the right audiences, and Abby and CCC have been great FDAs for you to improve your work. But what's the FDA that's not working?
Sorry, can someone repeat the question or comments so that everybody else can see it?
The Food and Drug Administration. So I was making a little joke that their art is great medicine, and I'm thankful to Abby and the CCC for delivering this medicine to us as the FDA. But what's the FDA that's still problematic for you all as artists?
Do you mean like what is not working in the relationship with the institution? What kinds of things aren't working? And
just more generally, yeah. I mean, what, yeah.
I would try. I think all of the artists here today express their gratitude towards the openness and freedom they experience working with CCC, and it's not necessarily every place And those limitations coming from institutions sometimes can be detrimental for new artists especially. Sometimes it's the vision that's being denied, or certain requirements is being set in place. It really influences how you think about the work. And as we know, young artists develop through this really sensitive process in a way, and those experiences really can form them as they continue in their career. So I think as artists of different racial and cultural background, sometimes that's not as visible. Like we experience it, it's not something you can really put your finger on. You sort of just know it kind of is what it is. But it's in a really subtle way that current kind of push you one way or another. And I think that's why a place like CCC is really a wonderful and supportive and rare place to really encourage and nurture young artists.
The only thing I can say is I don't have, I wonder about the gallery world right now. Because in the old times, that was what supported artists, and I feel like and I'm not an expert of it in any way, but it seems like the gallery model is falling apart. And we're also in this weird space where I think the collectors of yore are drifting off in a way, and that used to be the financial base for a lot of art practices, and that no longer exists. And so and I, again, no expert, but it seems to me that the government passes grants down to community organizations, and that is now the place where art is being supported, and there are issues with that too. But I think we're in this really strange time where nobody really knows what's going to support art anymore, and there's a lot of anxiety around artists. And we always talk about NEA being whittled down, and I think this is a problem. And the solution is yet to come. What will help art in the future?
I don't know if this would count as an FDA. A pet peeve of mine has been, and I've seen great examples of this, so I don't want to get myself in trouble, but I feel like loose ethnographic survey exhibitions within institutions has been a thing that has triggered me quite a few times. In that I notice a tendency, even in myself, to go into spaces like this, and it's almost as if the objective is implanted in my brain, that I'm looking at a set of this work from either a time period or a specific geographical location. And my job is to identify what these things have in common. And when I've been included in these exhibitions, having an insider view and sort of a broader historical context for the work that's being made, it doesn't make sense. And so that experience as an artist curated into a show based on a region or a time period or some kind of loose collection, I look at it and I say, well, I know these people, I know what sort of preceded this work, and I know where this is coming from, and this doesn't make sense. But not knowing that, I can tell stories. And to me, it feels like a disservice to the work and the artists themselves.
Are we losing time? Are we